It's ad break time. I am proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. On October 1st, they will be launching a new series called Art and System, which will be headed up by Tim Hutchings. The goal of the series is to showcase indie games and to push the boundaries of gaming. The first games to go to crowdfunding will be a revised edition of Liam Burke's Dog Eat Dog, Anna Anthropy's Princess with a Cursed Sword, and Timothy Kleinert's The Mountain Witch. This is a fantastic initiative that I am personally excited to support. Also, if you want to help me keep the lights on over here on the podcast, you can support me at patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today on the pod, I have a very special guest. This is Pat Harrigan. He
Hi.
is... How's it going?
Good.
All right, guys. Pat is a writer and editor from Minneapolis, so he's right across town from me. And he has an interest in games and media, a wide array of interests, as we could discuss. Pat, you have had a really wild career arc. You've worked for Fantasy Flight. You've done some books through MIT about games and media. And I
hmm
actually initially invited you on because you co-edited Zones of Control, Perspectives on Wargaming. Um,
Yes.
so uh, I guess just like what's the brief overview so people can understand who you are and where you come from?
Sure. Yeah. So I have just an undergraduate degree in English literature from the University of Redlands in Southern California. And, after graduating college, I kind of did a bunch of different things before eventually finding a spot in the marketing department at Fantasy Flight Games. This is way back in the early 2000s, so it was not nearly the huge board game company that it is now. I think we had 12 people by the time I left. I worked in the marketing department there, and then was briefly marketing director, which was not a good fit at all. I do not like managing people. But uh, in parallel to that, I was approached originally by my friend Noah Wardrop Fruin, who I went to college with and is now a professor at University of California, Santa Cruz. Although at the time he wasn't quite there yet, and he wanted to. He was in the process of editing this book based on panel discussions from the SIGGRAPH conference that had happened a year or two earlier. It was kind of in a it, he needed some assistance with it, and so I came on board, and that was how the book First Person came about. That was published by MIT Press back in 2004, and the subject matter of that book is a little bit academic. It was stuff related to ludology and narratology in games, and various emphases that academics were placing on one side of the debate or another. And that was maybe kind of my intro into the world of like academic writing about games. So that book did very well, and Noah and I went on to do second person and third person, and I drew on a lot of my experiences at FFG there. A lot of people in second person are people I knew personally, people who worked at Fantasy Flight Games or were otherwise associated with them. And then after those books were done, there was an essay in the third book, Third Person, by Matthew Kirschenbaum of the University of Maryland, was talking about war games. And we can talk about this a little bit more later, but we commissioned that essay and I was so impressed. I was like absolutely blown away by the depth of knowledge that Matt brought to the subject that casting around for the next project, I thought, let's see if Kirschenbaum wants to do Zones of Control. Or what the book that then became Zones of Control, and he agreed, and so that became our biggest book, largest, like physically largest book for MIT up to that point. I think we had about 60 contributors, and it really blossomed into a lot of areas that I hadn't expected. I was primarily interested in tabletop wargaming, and I didn't realize until going into it how many of the people who had designed tabletop wargames over the years also had connections in the professional wargaming sphere. People like Peter Perla and Yuna Wong who wound up contributing heavily to the book. And this was, national defense and kind of think tank sort of stuff that was interesting to learn about too. So in a lot of ways, I kind of fell backwards into a lot of this stuff. It was just kind of knowing the right people at the right time and being persistent enough to like, hey, do you want to work on this project with me? And as my background isn't, as I say, I'm not an academic. I don't teach or anything like that. I only have a BA, and my primary interest is in fiction writing. So that's what I do mostly these days. But the interest in war games and tabletop hobby gaming in general has never gone away. And so I'll take the opportunity to do panel presentations at conventions when I have the chance and things like that.
Nice. Yeah, actually, the first time I found out, like, I mean, I'd seen Zones of Control, but I connected you with it when I went to a panel at Convergence, which is like a local con here. Um, so yeah, good on the panels.
Yeah, that was a fun one. That was the one that it was just a few months ago.
Yeah,
That was we called it Wargaming Beyond War Games. We had Patrick Leader on board, Philip Henry from Fantasy Flight Games, and my old friend Tim Uren, who I've collaborated with on many things. He had also previously been a developer for Fantasy Flight, among other things. We talked about a lot of interesting stuff, including games that aren't particularly considered war games a lot of the time, or games that use war game like mechanics to model things that are not kinetic in nature.
yeah. So we can talk about a lot of that by talking about, I think, Zones of Control. So for people who have not encountered this book physically or browsed the table of contents, Zones of Control is an enormous book. It is long, which is fine, but it's also got a ton of different contributions and topics that get touched on. It's just like a whole array of war game stuff that you could think about. So, was the vision for the book originally this big, and how did you choose like which subheadings to put into this book?
It was partly modeled in the previous books that Noah and I had done for second and third person. Um, yeah, not to get too deep in the weeds or whatever, but those books had a sort of thesis and response structure to it, where there would be a long essay that then was responded to by other writers, and then the original writer would have an opportunity to respond to that. That was more the case in first person, where we had an online component too, where it was a kind of continually evolving thing on the electronic book review without people writing and then people responding. That had upsides and downsides, but one of the things that we did take away from that experience for Zones of Control was we would have a long essay that covered kind of more theoretical stuff or big picture things. And then would have smaller essays by other people that weren't responding to the large essays, but were in the same zone. They were, yeah, by designers talking about a specific game or a specific kind of idea that had been expressed in the larger essays. And partly the structure dictated itself. We knew we wanted to have a historical section on the growth of war games, how they develop. Wanted to have some contemporary stuff, ideas about where it could go in the future. We wanted to talk about the hobby game space. We wanted to talk about the professional defense industry space. And then I also wanted to, in a way, kind of tie it back to the previous books in the series. I think of them kind of as a series of four books, and talk about stuff that relates more to my background in the humanities. And so there's an essay by Bill McDonald in there that talks about the novel Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern, which is one of the first examples that I'm aware of in English literature that talks, it's not exactly wargaming, it's more like diorama building, but it is modeling war in a physical space, um, with people involved in moving things around. And so I wanted to have that kind of, I guess we call it a humanities background a little bit to counterbalance some of the other more technical things that were in there too. Oh, and also the essay by Adam Scott Glancy of Pagan Publishing, where we talked about wargaming as it's been historically depicted in uh, tabletop role-playing games, combat systems, things like Call of Cthulhu or Traveller, games like that. And that specifically tied in with essays that had been written for second and third person.
So when you're choosing your contributors, how much of it was like a call for papers, and then how many of these people were handpicked and invited?
In the case of all these books, they were all handpicked and invited. In the future, I think I would do a lot more, have a call for papers because, again, my bench isn't. At being not an academic, I'm not typically at conferences seeing new, interesting people giving interesting work. However, Noah and then Matt are those things. And so they were able to bring many contributors that would never have ever been on my radar into all four of the books.
Nice. And then, just kind of go back to that topic then, since they're handpicked, you and Matt did a really thorough job in the beginning, sort of talking about your identities, your attempts to bring in like as much of the global community as was reasonable for the projects, for the scope of this particular project. Trying to make sure that you didn't just have all white guys contribute. How did you go about attempting to diversify your contributor list? Because it's there's definitely a lot. Like I was really interested by seeing an essay by a Japanese game designer in here,
Mhm. And Tetsuo
etc.
Nakamura.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So like I guess what was your process for trying to increase diversity as a couple of white guys editing a book?
Yeah, that we could have done a better job on, I think. I think we did the best we could at the time, although I think I'd have more strategies for how to do it right now. Um, it was never any problem with first through third person to find a diversity of opinion and identity. Noah was able to fill in any gaps that I might have had. Now, it is a challenge to find women wargame designers, for instance, or rather, I should say, women tabletop wargame designers. Within the professional industry space, there are plenty of them. Um, in the case of the international perspective, I think we could have cast our net wider. It's just simply a matter of not knowing where to look, a lot of it. In the case of Tetsuo Nakamura, he had designed, he was quite well respected Japanese designer, but a lot of his games had been published in America by Multiman Publishing. And so there was that connection there. Multiman Publishing is just down the street from Kirschenbaum, and he knows those people pretty well. So that was one area in which to get it. And we really tried to find women wargame designers. There are almost none. So it was, at least in the United States. So we did what we could for that, and probably casting it a little wider. We were very conscious of this, of course, at the time because we are just a couple of white nerds doing it, and we wanted to expand it as much as we could. And that's part of the reason why we went a little further afield than just like the technical element of like who is designing a particular tabletop game. We wanted to have academics with their own opinions on that.
Interesting. So, as you mentioned, your book is structured in sections with kind of like a long chapter that kind of gives a meaty take on that section, and then a lot of smaller response essays. How long did that take? I'm assuming that the people who were like that lead essay had to have it done so that then others could respond, or did it not work that way this time?
In this case, no, not in Zones of Control. That was the case in first person, and I guess it would be the case for the first three of those books. And that, you're absolutely right. That's a bottleneck. If somebody's being late on something, then that kind of throws that whole section into disarray. That was one of the reasons that I, Matt and I decided that we weren't going to do it in exactly that way for Zones of Control. So everything was pretty much commissioned in parallel. Um, we added people as the project went on, but for the most part, everybody was writing independently according to their own schedules. Still quite a time-consuming process with 60 some contributors. Um, from commissioning to getting final drafts was, I don't know, 2 years, something like a year, 2 years, somewhere in there. Uh, yeah, it's it was easier for us to be able to do it that way than to have to wait on other people before we could then give the green light to somebody to respond.
Yeah, that's fair. Um, Having done it both ways, um, how do you feel about the shorter response essays? Like, did not having them be in direct response to somebody else's opinion lead to maybe more diverse takes because they weren't kind of led by a previous speaker? Or did you kind of like it the other way and just not have time?
I I think I preferred the zones of control thing. In a way, it was with first, second, third person when you have a kind of response structure, there is also a tendency, I think, for bigger personalities to get um, kind of worked up about stuff. And so that we were going for dialogue, we weren't going for argumentation in those books, but sometimes it was, especially when we're the middlemen, we're trying to um, negotiate what somebody might say over here. It's like, yeah, don't you think that's a little too sharp? Don't you think that maybe, you should rephrase it in this particular, and that's what editors do, and that's okay. um, but in a way, it was just simpler in zones of control to let the egos fly, and everybody can just say what they want. And we're here to provide a space for you to say what you want, and people aren't going to criticize you within the covers of this particular book. Having said that, I wish a lot of those essays in zones of control were, well, one longer. Like there are plenty of short essays there that I wish Mark Herman had written a whole long essay on his design philosophy. He's since written a book about his history of designing games, so it would be superfluous to requirements for us to exist in zones of control. But his contribution to zones of control is, it's not representative of his wider work in the field. It's really, I think he called it a motorcycle ride through an art gallery or something. And it really is like super quick. I wish he could have talked more about his particular designs. But the book was, I don't know, 600 pages long or whatever it is, and could easily have been 2 or 3 times as long.
Yeah, it's a big one. So when you were commissioning essays, how much guidance did you give the people you asked for what you would like them to write, and then how much of it was just something they chose in terms of their focus?
Yeah, that depended on the individual person. So certain people, Bill McDonald's essay on Tristram Shandy, I was like, Bill, please just write an essay on Tristram Shandy. That's exactly what I want you to do. Just You've been teaching English for 40 years. You go ahead and write whatever you want. Other people, Jenny Thompson with her essay on historical reenactments. I knew I wanted to have something in that neighborhood on there. With some of the other designers, um, Rex Bryan, Brian Train, Volker Runke, these guys have, Rex in particular has could write about anything I want him to write about. So in that case, we dialed in on, let's talk about non-kinetic war game designs, the non-combat side of war as it's represented on the tabletop.
Right.
So it was really kind of calibrated to each individual person.
Interesting. So here's a question then. As we talk about like who gets included, what thoughts get included, what does your own life as a wargamer look like? Just for starters.
Well, I have far too many of them for one thing.
Never.
Too many games in general. I've been trying to kind of offload some of them because I know I'm never going to play a fraction of them before I die. But then, as you can see, like from some of the books behind me or whatever, I have that problem with other things in my life. I have a library of books I'm never going to read all of. But more to your point, like I, I'm going to try to exist now with the war games that I have and only acquire a few more that I have on pre-order and such. And because I get them to the table less frequently than I want, I'll often read a rule set and then it just sort of flitters away. I never actually get around to playing it. And then the games that I do play, I'll often play just once or maybe twice, and then I'm impatient. I want to go on to the next game, learn the next system. And so a lot of games that I feel I know pretty well, I have kind of only scratched the surface of because I might have actually only played them once or twice. Something I've just started out recently, I picked up this Dawn of Battle system by Mike Nagel, specifically because I thought, well, here's a system that's relatively simple that I feel that I can learn, and I can get together with a particular friend of mine once a month or so, and we'll know the system. We don't need to learn a completely new thing each time, so we can just get rolling on each new historical scenario. And that was kind of my pick for. I want to go deep into one system so I don't need to do the overhead brain work of trying to figure everything out from scratch each time, and I can just kind of hit the table running. And we're still in the process of working out whether that's gonna happen or not, because also I've got oh, I've got games coming up that I want to play Cross Bronx Expressway when it comes out. I want to get people together to do that. And so
Hell yeah.
I was kind of chasing the new shiny thing as well.
I'll come over.
Yeah, please. Yeah. I think GMT is charging for that in the next couple of weeks. So I think I'll have it in hand within a month or two.
Yes, actually, NB showed me like the cover, like had a prototype at Gen Con, and it was very thrilling.
Oh,
It's
nice.
soon.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it because I recently read Robert Caro's big book on Robert Moses, the architect of modern New York. Absolutely fascinating stuff, and this game is going to hit, I think, that sweet spot of my historical interest and my systems understanding and things like that. And I've actually not looked at any of the rules or anything that are online because I want to maintain my interest until the box is actually in front of me and I can open it.
Fair
But that's
enough.
the thing that I'm looking forward to the most.
That's I'm with you actually. um, but okay, so this also kind of leads into the this is an eternal question. I actually hate arguing about it, but it's important to discuss when you've done a whole book about war games, which is for you, like what does wargaming encompass? Like how broad is that definition for you?
Yeah, I try to be kind of ecumenical about it. There's nothing wargamers like more than arguing about what is or isn't a war game. The classic one is Twilight Struggle. Everybody has an opinion on whether Twilight Struggle is a war game or not. Don't really care. I wargaming is one of those Wittgensteinian words that can just kind of be applied to anything. You can sit in a corporate boardroom and say we're going to war game out the next quarter of earnings. It's too broad. For me, it's I don't know. Conflict simulation is the other term, which kind of is the same problem in a different register, but because everything's a conflict, and obviously we're working in a simulation. Uh, but yeah, your old school war gamers are going to be like this. It needs hex encounters or maybe minis, and it's going to be about the Russian front. And that's fine. I play those games too, but these days I'm more interested in modeling complex systems on the tabletop in new and interesting ways, particularly about subjects that I might not know much about. I know plenty about World War II. I don't necessarily feel like I'm going to deepen my understanding of um, D-Day by playing Memo 44 again, although there's nothing wrong with that. I like that game too. But in these days, I'm much more like, I want to play John Company. I want to play this mess of interlocking systems that does its best to model a historical reality um, with innovative with innovative game design. And there's conflict in a military sense in John Company as well, but it's only one part of the larger interactive system.
Yes, that is true. I also asked because you mentioned that you had a non-kinetic section
Hmm.
of this book, which is true. Um, so I guess my thought was like, as you and Matthew decided to like put these sections together, I know you had some more humanities focused sections, but you also explicitly go into non-kinetic warfare. You're kind of pushing like what a war game could be in terms of what gets included in the book. So like, what were the parameters that y'all set at the time of project inception?
It's a good question because the parameters did get larger, as I mentioned. I'm much more of a gaming nerd, and Matt is the more academic. So he was able to expand the parameters of what the book was going to focus on more than I would. In terms of the non-kinetic specifically, we really wanted Rex Brynan. If your listeners don't know, he runs a website called PAX Sims.
Yeah. Oh, he's been a guest.
Okay, yeah, well, good, yes, because he's marvelous. He wrote it. In this case, he wrote an essay with Brian. No, I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm getting that wrong. Brian and Volka wrote an essay together, but we really wanted Rex because he's kind of the authority on that type of non-kinetic systems modeling.
So the other reason I was very curious about this question in particular for you is that because of the panel that you did at Convergence, like you strike me as somebody who is, I guess, interested in the liminal spaces of wargaming to an extent. So, I mean, you did a panel about wargaming outside of wargaming. What kind of struck you as important about having that conversation?
I guess um, well, it's a personal interest, so whether it's important or not is not for me to judge. But
It's important to
uh,
you.
it is important to me because I feel, um, I guess, when I think about gaming in general, I remember my time back at Fantasy Flight, and I met tons of astonishing designers, like really intelligent people. Eric Lang, Kevin Wilson, things like that. But a frustration for me working there was, well, it's a lot of intellectual heft in service of kind of trivialities. What's another kind of generic fantasy game? What's a generic science fiction setting? That kind of stuff, a Harry Potter thing or whatever. Uh, and I felt this kind of yearning, like I want to see how this kind of brain power can model real things. There are things that I consider more important. Nothing wrong with playing fantasy games or whatever. I do it all the time. But I felt like there was something missing. And the war games in the classical sense, the hex and counter stuff really filled that for me initially. Like, here's somebody taking an historical event and they're modeling it. They're choosing what there is from history that they consider to be important, and they're putting it into a dynamic system. And that is, it's can't even imagine where you begin to do that. It's so good. But um, from there, it expanded to me as I learned more about, well, these systems can model hypothetical conflicts. They can model things that are not really conflicts at all, or they're conflicts in a non-military sense, like cross Bronx Expressway, or historical dynamics like John Company. Um, then the question becomes, I guess, are these models useful in any particular way, kind of in a utilitarian way? Or how do we understand the world? Are they, isn't it just some guy's idea of like how history operated? And that's where the real analysis comes in. That's where the interesting part of things to me happens. You take a game on Gettysburg, and then you take a second and a third game on Gettysburg, and you see how people understand history in different ways. This game, uh, the Confederates are just simply better as troops. That's one way of understanding history. But in Bound Simmons' Guns of Gettysburg, all the troops are exactly the same, and the difference in outcome is really going to be based on artillery and positioning, things like that. That's a different way of looking at the historical event and deciding what's important enough to model on a tabletop. And it's not for me to decide which one of those things is better or worse, but it is interesting for me to think about how those systems get designed.
Yeah, interesting you bring up Civil War games because I know that you have actually published on this topic before. I was
A little, yeah.
stalking you online and found
Yeah,
from Romchip, game history as public debate, and your focus there is intensely on the Civil War. What I mean, I think we all have like the game period topic that kind of gets us going. So for some people, it's World War II. For some people, it's the Civil War. Like, what about Civil War games compelled you to want to talk about them more?
yeah, that was kind of a dovetailing interest. It's just an interest that I've developed over the last 15 or 20 years. It started with Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, the way it has with a lot of people, but also James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, probably the best single volume history of the Civil War that I'm aware of, and David Blight's lecture on the war at iTunes U. So between all those things, I really did develop a historical interest in the war. And so when I was getting into tabletop wargaming in a serious way, that was kind of my initial entry point. Oh, I bought the old Gettysburg game. I started collecting the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series from MMP. Um, it Not to get too political or whatever, but
Uh,
like
this is this is my
yeah,
podcast. You can say what you want.
okay. I mean, the war is fascinating to me in a way that like the revolution isn't, because the problems never went away. They just got swept under the rug, and now we're dealing with them, you know, in the 21st century too. Like there was a period in Reconstruction where there was a real opportunity for America to course correct and make a civilization based on genuine racial equality, and we fucked it up. And we're still dealing with all of this today. So it's just this nagging thing in the back of my mind, and in a way, in a way, it's soothing to go back to a game about Gettysburg or Shiloh or well, maybe not Shiloh, but these Civil War games, and just oh, you could redo it, you could do it better. It seems simpler. Well, it
Hmm.
seems simpler on the tabletop because they just talk about military maneuvers and things that they don't, generally speaking, talk about the politics um, or the racial animus behind everything there. But those are areas in games that I am interested in, or I'm interested in seeing games that do talk about things outside of the strictly military. There was a game by MMP called Lincoln's War, came out a few years ago, that did track things like political will and the how much each side really wanted to fight. I didn't really think the game worked all that well, but it's the kind of thing that I like to see demonstrated on the tabletop.
Yeah, no, I really feel you there actually. So the other thing that kind of interests me about the you wanting to talk about like war games outside of wargaming was that I feel like a lot of the conversation recently, again, kind of centered around like what is a war game and what can war games be about, is more about things like Waros and like the bringing of hobby mechanisms into war games. So you see a lot more like war game deck builders, Night Witches, which David and Thompson and I did together, and then also another upcoming game of ours, Queen of Spies, has a lot to do with bag pull as a major mechanism in the game. And so, we have a lot of these conversations about external ideas coming in to wargaming, but not so much like wargame ideas going out into the mainstream. And so, why do you think that is? And what kind of mechanisms do you see moving in the direction you're talking about, as opposed to like into the wargaming hobby?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit on the panel. It's an interesting question because first you have to define, well, what is a wargaming mechanism, and how does that travel outside of the wargaming space into the wider hobby space? And we wrestled with that when we were organizing the panel, because once we had developed the topic, I was like, well, do I actually have anything to say about this? Do I know anything about this? So the panel became just kind of wide. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff in general. And the main thing, speaking to your point, that I think we talked about most on the panel was the game Root by Leader Games, Cole Worley's design, which the first time I played it, it was strikingly close to one of the coin system games from GMT. I'm not at all claiming that it's a ripoff of it, but it's exactly that kind of thing where it's an asymmetrical game. All the factions have their different abilities, their different goals, and their different modes of interaction. And that's something that's typical of the coin series. And I think Worley is said specifically that he was influenced by it when he was designing Root. So that's the most obvious thing to me that I can see that has come out of what is traditionally considered to be a wargaming space into a wider hobby game space. I think Root has even sold at like Target these days,
Yes.
which I think must surprise a lot of people who buy it because it's a fairly complicated game and it's difficult to do well at. But it looks so cute.
Yes, I do worry about like the families that bought it because of the cute animals.
Like,
Um,
what is this? Hmm.
Maybe they learned how to also have family fight time. No,
Hmm. Maybe they learn how to conduct an insurgency, which would also be a good thing for families to learn, possibly in the near future.
look, as a child, I would have loved to know so much more about insurgency. So,
Hmm. Yes,
as a teacher, my students already had some instincts about insurgency. So,
good life lessons.
so aside from Roots, I feel like we talk a lot about you were working for Fantasy Flight. I think a lot of kind of sci-fi and to an extent fantasy games do like. So right now, for context, I'm running an annual thing I do with Brant from the Armchair Dragoons of top solo historical games. We call it historical games specifically because if you said war games, you would also be counting sci-fi stuff. And so, like within the hobby, there are these permutations, but like Red Dust of Rebellion is the newest coin, and that's about Mars. And so, like that's come into the wargaming hobby, but also like sci-fi war games have existed for a long time. GMT is publishing things like Plum Island Horror. Is this something that you also kind of noticed at Fantasy Flight when you were there?
Yeah, at FFG, we didn't, at the time at least, we didn't publish much that I would consider uh, too much wargame adjacent. We did publish Lou Pulsipher's Britannia, a new edition of Britannia back when I was there. And so that was maybe the closest that I can recall at the time being war. I mean, I guess there's Chris's Twilight Imperium, which is certainly a war game from one perspective. I admit I've never gotten it to the table. It's too big, but yeah.
Yeah, I've only played that one once, and it's because Matt Martins from Space Cats Peace Turtles works in the same office as me. So we had a
Okay.
Christmas Twilight Imperium, really fostered some love in the office. So, you also mentioned that you're like a wider hobby gamer. How much crossover do you see between the war games you're playing and like the more mainstream games that you're playing now? And do you think that that's changed over time?
It certainly changed for me personally. As a kid, I was much more into tabletop role playing games. I still am, still do them. And I was very intimidated by war games personally. Those big Avalon Hill double columned tiny print rule books were just, like way beyond me. Um, these days, well, when I get together with people to play games, typically my gaming group is five people, um, including me, and we don't do war games. One of our players, it's just very specifically like, nope, don't want to do war games. I respect that. I just don't think she wants any kind of real people were really hurt in this thing that we're modeling. So, but she has no problem playing Gloomhaven, which is what we did for about 4.5 years. And Gloomhaven is maybe a good example of it's a tactical war game, really, when you get right down to it. It's a fairly simple one compared to something like Advanced Squad Leader, but it's still that. It's you're still moving your figures around and you're checking line of sight and range and terrain and things like that. These are things that are typical to war games since the 1950s. And Gloomhaven is one of the most popular tabletop games that's ever been published. So yeah, I mean the kind of fundamental wargaming concepts have been around for so long that they've trickled deeply into mainstream games. You can't get much more mainstream than Memoir 44, which is a very light war game, but is the big bestseller and probably a lot of people's entry into the field.
It's true. So speaking of like sort of liminal spaces, I guess like we've talked about the limits of wargaming and where it crosses into hobby gaming, but I feel like you and I are also, I guess, liminal people in the sense that I'm post-ac and you are very like as you don't call yourself an academic, but you're very clearly doing like public academic work and publishing through academic presses, and you've been doing it for a long time. So how do you feel that academic attitudes towards talking about things like gaming have changed over the course of your career, and also, you know, how have you sensed like more openness, I guess, within academia to hearing non-academic perspectives and participating in conversations, with people who don't have the paper but can do stuff on the ground?
In terms of yeah, I mean, I think it's changed significantly in my experience in the last, I suppose it's about 25 years now since we first started doing first person. When we were doing second person in particular, there wasn't a lot of academic writing on tabletop hobby games generally, or RPGs in particular. Now there's lots and lots. Zones of Control, when MIT Press published it, was the first book in their game histories series. They had not done. They'd done lots and lots of stuff on video games and other digital formats before then, but our stuff was pretty much the stuff that Noah and then Matt and I did are pretty much the first things that they published on tabletop games to my knowledge. And since then, I've been kind of watching, and MIT has been publishing lots of books in the game history series, including by Rayford Gines and Henry Lowood. These are people, many of whom contributed to Zones of Control. John Peterson, who wrote these tremendous books on Dungeons and Dragons. They're publishing his stuff these days. Marco Annuto. Um, these are big names in the hobby game field, and now they're becoming big names in mainstream academia too. Again, I'm on the sidelines of academia in general, so I don't really know like what happens at all the conferences and what the attitudes are toward non-professionals. But I kind of think academia is in crisis in general these days, and so I think maybe there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of um, uh, developing ideas that come from outside academic culture, coming directly from the designers or coming from amateur academics like myself. But it is definitely different than it was back in 2000 when there was practically nothing published on tabletop games to my knowledge.
Yeah. I also feel like I've seen a big uptick in recent years, like since starting the podcast to now. I feel like video games, it's easy to find people talking about those now. And then board games, it's a growth field.
It is, and I'm kind of feeling a little left out of some of those spaces myself because I used to know tons about contemporary tabletop role-playing game culture back in second person. I thought I really had a handle of it. But as I'm sure you're aware, like that's changed enormously in the last 20 years. It's diversified incredibly. There's lots of these interesting new mechanics and table safety mechanisms, X cards and things like that that just didn't exist back when I was studying the stuff in general. And you kind of struggle to incorporate now when I get people around the table. I'm like, oh, let's try these new kind of safety ideas or collaborative storytelling ideas that yeah, wouldn't across my mind 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I'm just happy for the rise of solo journaling RPGs because I'm primarily a
Hmm.
solo gamer. So for me, like getting to have a piece of that community without having to find a regular night to do it, which is why I think a lot of people become solo gamers, has been wonderful. One more kind of like change of direction. So we talked about Zenzo Control, we
Hmm.
talked a lot about wargaming, but like you are a very multifaceted person. You're also an author.
Hmm.
So first, just what kind of fiction do you write?
So I have a couple of books. Well, so I'm primarily a self-published author. Let's get that out there right there. So I write mostly short stories. These days I've been writing explicitly weird microfictions for the website. Okay, there's a theatrical production company in Minneapolis called Ghoulish Delights that puts on live performances and podcasts and things like that. And I publish a short story there every Sunday in a series called The Sunday Scaries. So it's typically a 400 to 500 word microfiction story. And that's been running since the beginning of 2004. And I intend to wrap it up at the end of 2026. Did I say 2004? I meant 2024. So 3 years worth
Yeah.
of stuff when it's all said and done. I recently published a short novella called The Tristans by Isabel Chase Montgomery. Which is probably the best thing I've ever written. It's currently only available on Amazon.com. I hope to get that outside of Jeff Bezos's area and into something better. But people want to check out a little bit of my writing, Pat Harrigan. You can kind of Google that stuff around. Yeah, I've been writing in a casual way, fiction for a long time, and haven't had much luck as a published author. Although I've got a couple things here and there from Pagan Publishing and Chaosium and a few other places over the years. But it's kind of my primary impulse. Like when I'm not creating something, I feel like I'm not doing it. I'm not doing life correctly. I need to be
Yeah.
able to create and do something, or to do something like Sense and Control, really kind of dig into a big academic project. But these days, it's fiction, at least for the foreseeable future.
That's interesting. Do you see I guess some of the same impulses that drive you to write in your gaming life, especially since you mentioned that you're interested in
Hmm.
role playing?
Yeah, that was one of the main engines behind doing second person in particular. My in the back of my mind, the idea of human creativity is really authorship. It's novelistic authorship. It's something like Charles Dickens or James Joyce sitting down, and my brain is going to create these characters in these situations and develop a personal style. And so, really, that's fundamental to my understanding of what human creativity is. But that's not obviously everything that it can be. There are plenty of collaborative art forms out there. If you're working on a movie, it's not just one person um, producing every single bit about the film. And RPGs have been a really good brain expander for me in exactly that way. Because it's not just one person, it's not the game master saying, I am creating this story. Depending on the system, it could be very democratic. It could be everybody around the table is equally contributing to the story. And I know a lot of people in town who are actors or comedians, and in particular, improv comedy is really fascinating to me because I've never attempted to do it because that would be terrible. No one would want to see it. But to have people on stage, smart, quick-witted people working within a structure and then just marvelously creating something completely new that no one could have anticipated before the beginning of the evening, that's amazing to me. And that's on the same kind of spectrum as RPGs, where it's not specifically designed to make an audience laugh. In fact, the audience is usually just the performer or the participants themselves. But that, when I really started thinking about that, was why I wanted to uh, do second person in the first place, because these systems, because I'm always interested in these systems, like in this case, you have a system for creating a story, and it can be as simple as an indie RPG from Jason Morningstar or something that's a couple of pages long, or it could be as complex as D&D Fifth Edition. But in any case, it's the people involved don't know where the story is going to be by the end of the scenario, and that's terrific to me. It's a way also, I think, of breaking my ego a little bit apart, because when you're an author writing, you're like, oh, it's all on me, I have to do that. And it helps to just be like, I'm in an environment with other creative people, and the weight of everything isn't on one person or another. I feel it gets I think it's one of the best ways that you can spend your time if you have a good gaming group these days. It's so pro-social, it's face to face if you can manage it. We all need this kind of community, especially these days, and to be able to assist one another in creating marvelous works of art that you couldn't have anticipated before when you woke up that morning. It's, I don't know, I'm babbling a little bit, but a little evangelical about the subject. I love that in RPGs.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you think board games kind of fit? I know that there've been board games that tell stories, or like, oh, narrative in board games. As somebody who actively both role plays and writes fiction, so you're creating narratives of your own, what do you think that is the board gaming capacity for narrative, and what are, I guess, the limitations of that kind of storytelling?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've played a lot of examples of storytelling board games. I guess on one end of things, you have something like Eric Goldberg's Tales of the Arabian Nights, which is it is a storytelling game, but the story is already compacted within the big book, and it's more like a choose your own adventure sort of thing where you're going from one element to another, and that's kind of the opposite of what I was talking about. It's like there's already a universe of story that has already been created that you're sort of picking a path between. I love the game, but it doesn't uh, emergent is the word I'm looking for. It doesn't develop emergent storytelling, and
Yeah.
I wonder how board games can really do that. I don't know. We play a lot of like detective games in my group. Consulting Detectives, one of
Oh
our
yeah.
one of our favorites. I've loved that one since I was a kid. But again, those are things where the story exists and you're making your way through it. Um, to make a story, I don't know. I just picked up a game. I mean, you certainly know it, called A Quiet Year, which I haven't gotten to the table yet, which is a collaborative map making game. And so it's not quite the same because it doesn't have game mechanics, or it doesn't have, well, it is tabletop role playing game mechanics. It doesn't have war game mechanics or anything like that. But we talk about games and storytelling a lot in these books that we edited. Um, Yeah, but I've drawn no conclusions, and I have no idea where it's going to go necessarily. I don't know where the field's going to go in general. Probably more toward low cost production stuff if all these tariffs are going to just kind of wreck the capacity of a lot of game publishers to publish big games. And probably going to go toward more small rule sets, small number of components, that kind of thing. So maybe more toward just old-fashioned tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. It's interesting to think about this in the context of tariffs, because I feel like Yeah, the day of just kind of doing whatever you want in terms of production is currently on pause. And so what will that mean for like the artistic range of what we can do in board games? I suppose we'll have to revisit that in a few years and see. But uh, for the current moment, I've taken
Yeah.
just about an hour of your time. So you get softy questions.
All right, sure.
Since you're both a reader and a gamer, I normally just ask people what they've been playing recently they enjoyed, but
Mhm.
I want a book and a game recommendation from you.
Okay. Uh, well, here, let me quick pull up my list of books that I've read this year, just to so I'm not just blanking on everything. But okay, so game recommendation. Oh gosh, what have I been doing? Okay, so how about I'll be very simple and say Mark Herman's recent Gettysburg game. That he's developing this into a whole system. There's a game called Rebel Fury from GMT that talks about other Civil War battles, but I've really liked the Gettysburg game that I played. I think if anybody is at all interested in A, the Civil War, or B, wargaming in general, this would be a great intro to it. It's very quick playing, it's very intuitive, and yeah, I forget C3I think publishes it, and then the later games in the system or will be coming from GMT. In terms of books, gosh, let me so many. Uh, I recently I've reread a couple of favorites recently, and I'll recommend Italo Calvino's novel Invisible Cities, which is a short book about imagined conversations between Kubla Khan and Marco Polo about strange cities that Marco Polo may or may not have visited. And I read this book 20, 30 years ago and loved it then. I only just got around to reading it again a few weeks ago. But this is um, particularly in the context of the very short fictions that I've been currently writing. It's great to look at examples of much better writers writing something in the same area. Like, how can you do a lot with a very small number of words? Oh, because I should say that it's a novel only in the loosest sense. There's like a page of description of a city, and then another page of description of a different city, and so on over the course of 100 some pages. So, but if anybody wants one of the great minor classics of Italian modernist literature, Invisible Cities is the way to go, I think, and it's probably the best book to introduce you to Calvino's style.
Okay, I'm very curious now.
I love
uh,
it.
and then if you want to follow your work, see what you're up to, where are you easiest to find online?
So I have an Amazon webpage. You just look for Pat Harrigan. You'll find the novella I recommended or I mentioned earlier. Also, I have the short stories weekly at ghoulishdelights.com. They're called the Sunday Scaries. And then also for any Doctor Who fans in the audience, I have a long-running podcast about Doctor Who that I've been doing for the last 10 years, and that is at getoffmyworldpodcast.com. We'll have another episode coming up in a few days. We usually update every few months. It's not a very quick one, but we have been doing it for a while. So there's 80 some episodes for anybody who wants to hear us talk about mostly the classic era of Doctor Who.
That's awesome.
Mhm.
All right. Anybody who's looking for me, of course, I can be found anywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Pat, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a delightful conversation. I've really liked getting to know you.
Thank you, Liz. This has been great. I appreciate the invitation and love to do it again, hang out and play Cross Bronx Expressway or something sometime.
Yeah, that'll be easy. We're across town.
Right on.
All right, everybody, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.